call this a keynote, but as you can see, it is not a sort of speech. And Peter, if I may, I'd like to ask the first question. But I think it'd be useful for us to get to know you a bit better, where you've come from. You're the Chief Programs Officer at the Foundation, focusing on education and youth development. What has brought you to this role? Can you draw just a brief arc of your own career and how you got to be doing the work that you're doing and why you're doing the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much, Patrick, for inviting me to be here. And thank you all for the great work that you're doing as members of this collaborative. We are all in the MasterCard Foundation very excited about this. I have really a deep appreciation for this collaborative and the way we are bringing everyone together. I want to thank the leaders of the institutions, but also those from government and from the regulatory bodies who are here, because it's going to take everyone to achieve the goal of this collaborative. And as they say in our continent, it takes a village to raise a child. I think this is what is happening here. So deeply excited about this. And I want to bring you also greetings from my boss, Rita Roy, who is the president of MasterCard Foundation. She is very committed to this collaborative, as some of you may know. And in about 10 days' time, our whole executive and our whole board is going to be here and is going to want to learn about this collaborative because of the power it has. So I just wanted to say that it's not only about me, it is about the MasterCard Foundation. All of us deeply appreciate what you're doing here. I started my career as an academic. I'm an engineer by training. Rose to become a professor of engineering and dean of engineering, dean of graduates school. And I've always tried in those days to see how can we leverage higher education to be a transformative force in development. When I was dean, I tried to introduce ABET accreditation in the engineering school where I was, and I got a lot of resistance from my very senior colleagues in the institution. We couldn't do it, you know. And later, the World Bank invited me for a small assignment in higher education, which ended up being a 17 years journey and a very rewarding career at the World Bank. But again, there, what I always tried to do was to see how can we leverage higher education in Africa to transform the continent socioeconomically. I'm very much opposed to the idea of you have to finish primary and then do tertiary. So, and we managed to do a few things at that time, the Africa Centers of Excellence Initiative, which some of you may know about, and so on. And I was really pleased when I joined the MasterCard Foundation about 7 years ago, that it was an opportune time when the foundation was in the process of asking itself, what can we do for the next 10 years to be transformative? And at that time, I was responsible for the education and learning agenda of the foundation. And I'm glad to say that it was at that time that this collaborative grew to become a collaborative beyond the partnership we had with Ashesi University at that time. And within a very short period of time, it has become this wonderful, wonderful force, which brings a lot of hope as we think about the future. Yeah, now, Patrick, it must have taken a lot of courage to start this whole thing and to start, first of all, to step out of your beautiful job in Microsoft, to start Ashesi, and then to start the. What inspired you to really get into this?
To get to Ashesi or to start the collaborative?
Both of them, the journey.
Okay. Well, The inspiration to leave Microsoft to get involved with education on the continent was really the birth of my first child. And what that triggered for me was this notion that there are future generations of Africans coming. And this question of development in Africa is a very important question for those future generations. So how Africans move in the world is really impacted by the development of the continent. So that was the trigger for me to think about doing something different than I was doing, which was engineering at Microsoft. Now, the Education Collaborative, as Rose mentioned, we started it in 2017. And a few years before the collaborative actually launched, we had been thinking about the second decade of Ashesi. So, my executive team is working with the board to think about what Ashesi's strategy for 10 years should be. And as you might imagine, the focus is on what can we do as a university to further our mission, and how do we address some of the challenges confronting our organization moving forward. But in thinking about our mission in particular, it was very clear that the mission is really about Africa. It's about African development. And it became clear that if we're really thinking about the continent, then the scale of the problem is a billion people question, soon to be 2.5 billion people question. So that's number one. And number two, it was clear that no one institution can address that scale. Not us and not anybody else. So that caused us to start to think about what should we be doing really to try to address the question of scale. And initially it wasn't very obvious to us. But one of the questions that we asked was, should we think about our problems as an institution, or should we think about the problem, right? Because as people were saying, why should we spend our time trying to work with other universities and invest a lot of time and resources, which nobody feels we have enough of, when we have so many pressing things ourselves? But ultimately, the board and our executive team decided that we had to think about the problem. And to think about the problem, we had to engage with our colleagues around the continent. So that's where the idea came to set up a collaboration where we're working with each other to strengthen all our institutions.
So we are in 2023 now, going to 2024. What's your vision of success by 2030? I heard a little bit of what Rose said earlier. What's your vision? And perhaps most importantly, what will it take to achieve that vision? And how can we be more supportive to this?
Okay, well, so what's the vision for, how will we know that the Education Collaborative has been successful? That's your question. Okay. Okay, that's a fair question. Start with the end in mind. Well, I've hinted a little bit at it that, ultimately what we're all trying to do is really address the question of development on the continent. For the collaborative specifically, I think it's useful for us to look at models elsewhere that have worked. It's useful for us to think about where do we want to see the continent be in a generation. So when I think about success for Education Collaborative, I'm not thinking about even this 10-year journey that we're on now. I'm thinking about more of a 30-year journey. And so we're starting to do the work now so that 30 years from now, we should have evidence, clarity in the world, that there is a network of extraordinary institutions of higher learning on the African continent whose graduates are really moving the continent forward in every way. And these institutions should be so well respected that there'll be kids in London and New York and Singapore thinking about what their first choice university is that they want to go to. And this network will be among the choices. The same way that kids all over the world, when they think about where they want to go, they will think about a Harvard or a Stanford or Cambridge or a Swarthmore, that we will have institutions of that kind of caliber on the continent. But most importantly is that we will be able to point to graduates of these institutions operating in this network who have demonstrated exemplary leadership on the continent and who have made people's lives better.
Thank you, Patrick. That is, you remind me of something I read in the past when China wanted to really strengthen its higher education system to be a force for transformation, how they took a 30-year journey to start investing in a network of starting with a small set of institutions and then growing it over time with continuous and sustained investments, but targeting transformation in key sectors. And we know today that you have a number of world-class institutions in that country.
Right.
So I think you are onto something really big here. And,
right.
Yeah, it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of that.
So the MasterCard Foundation has funded this collaborative, but I know that you're also funding other efforts, other collaborations. What is driving that decision, and what are you hoping that these networks, if you will do?
Yeah. First, let me say, education has always been at the core of the MasterCard Foundation's work. We are established as a charity organization in Canada with two charitable purposes. The first one is education and learning for young people, and the second one is financial inclusion for the poor. And so education is at the core of our work. And right from early on, we established in 2006, right from early on, we did see that education is, in this continent in particular, is key to socioeconomic transformation. We didn't know much how to get involved. But what we thought could be a good starting point at that time was to invest for the long term to create a new generation of transformative leaders in the continent who would lead change in their communities and in their countries. That's the Scholars, the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program.
Right.
And as you know, Ashesi University was one of the very first institutions to benefit from that, along with a few others globally. But targeting young people in Africa, and we made a decision at that time also to target young people from the most economically disadvantaged backgrounds, because we knew that there is talent there, but those are the ones who never had the opportunity to get quality education and really become the change makers in their own families and their communities, break the poverty cycle in their communities. So we started that around 2010, 2011. Last year we celebrated 10 years of the Scholars Program in Kigali, and it's been a learning journey. It's been a learning journey. And as we went through that journey, what became quite apparent is that some institutions were truly already arriving at the destination that we had set to arrive at maybe in 30 years. That they had mainstreamed ethical leadership, supporting young people to transition successfully. The alumni were getting into work, and they were already starting to inspire change in their communities. And Ashesi was one of the very first ones to go there.
Well, thank you for saying that.
So that is how we started with Patrick. Patrick came to us with a very good idea at that time. I hope you remember Patrick. He said, I've been thinking very deeply about how to scale up Ashesi University. I've thought about the option of building campuses in other countries. But that will be too slow because the change needs to happen faster in this continent. So where I'm landing is that instead of scaling up through additional campuses around the continent, I'm going to scale up the model through a collaborative where welcome institutions that are interested in learning from us what we are doing to become part of a network. Yeah? And over time, grow that network to become bigger and bigger. Frankly, we didn't understand very clearly, but it sounded like a great idea. So we said, let's throw ourselves behind it. And then we let Patrick go ahead and work on it. Of course, we continue to support Ashesi University. But we are all pleasantly surprised to see what has come out of it. So Patrick, I want to say a big thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And thanks to Rose and her team. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Yeah, and also, yes, a big thank you to all of you for having the courage to step forward. Because it takes courage to inspire change in institutions of higher learning. I came from that tribe. I know how difficult it is to bring change in institutions of higher learning. And particularly for those of you who are from public universities, it takes even more courage there. So I really want to say thank you very much. Now, last point I want to make here is that what started with Patrick and the Ashesi University has inspired the foundation to support a number of other collaboratives. We have now a collaborative in health, universities collaborative in health, which has a number of universities, I think 80 universities in the continent and the University of Toronto. We have a collaborative in pandemic sciences, which started during this period of COVID to try and deepen our understanding and human capacity in dealing with pandemics. We have another collaborative on climate, which is going to try and understand how can Africa take a different route to the climate challenge, which is beneficial to Africa rather than being a recipient of ideas from other people out there. And we have another one which is not called a collaborative, that looks like one, which is with the Carnegie Mellon University in Africa, based in Kigali, and 9 other universities in Africa, which is focusing on digital transformation. And that one also is taking off now. And we have been working with Ruforum as well around this network of universities in agriculture. So we've seen the emergence of this really intentionally set up networks of institutions of higher learning coming together and asking themselves, how can we transform this area or that area, which is critical to Africa's socio-economic transformation? I think we're up to something big here. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's great to see all of these blooming. So there's another aspect of our work that that the foundation is funding, and when I say our work, the collaborative. By the way, I don't know if you guys noticed that the logo for the collaborative is remove the Ashesi logo. Did you notice that? So if you see some of the older things, there's the Ashesi logo and the Education Collaborative, and now it's just the Education Collaborative. This is really a very sincere effort to create a network that is not about any one institution. So this collaborative we came to you and proposed that it might be a good idea for us to work together to come up with a new ranking system for sub-Saharan African universities. And you jumped at that too and said, hey, that sounds like an interesting idea that we can get behind. Can you sort of unpack some of your thinking as you were making that decision?
I was very pleased when you came to us and said you want to develop a ranking or a benchmarking framework for Africa.
Right.
Yeah. I personally believe very strongly that what is measured gets to be managed better. If you don't measure, you will not be able to really know whether you're making progress or not. And if measure, you know, where do I need to do better? And therefore, it also helps with deciding where to prioritize resource allocation. So for me, that was fundamentally the right direction. It's something that when I was at the World Bank, I tried to work with colleagues to get that moving. It never went anywhere. It's very difficult. So again, kudos for really bringing it to this point. The idea is, I think it was the provost who was talking about, it's not about competition. It is not about competition. It's about benchmarking ourselves, or an institution benchmarking itself against itself at different points in time to know whether you are making progress. Of course, if you decide as an institution, the University of Ghana, I want to compare myself with the University of Cape Coast, that's a different choice that the institution can make itself. But most important is to see, has the University of Ghana, you know, or any other university made progress between 2023 and 2027? I think if we can see it that way, we can all benefit a lot from it. And I would really encourage every institution that is here and those who are not here to look at it that way and to step into it. It is all, I believe, is the right way to go for us to make progress.
Yeah, so I agree. So there's another, so for those of you who are not familiar, we set up an effort. There are 4 organizations that worked with us in the collaborative to come up with a draft for a ranking for sub-Saharan Africa, African universities. And as Peter said, the most important thing is trying to identify what metrics to measure to begin with. Now, that effort and Times Higher Ed is actually going to publish the first results of that effort, which has been going on the last year, next week. To everyone's pleasant surprise, 120 universities signed up. I think something like 88 completed and will be ranked next week. But we see that as actually a journey. The ranking is going to evolve over time as we learn how to measure things better. But one of the things that I guess I wasn't expecting necessarily was, I think that the process of trying to identify the metrics actually revealed to us some key things that this collaborative should be focusing on, almost as our mission. And let me explain. So we, of course, surveyed professors, university leaders, and so on. But we decided to do a bigger survey. So surveyed 1,000 people from 3 countries, Ghana, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. And these were students, professors, market women, business professionals, just a cross-section of society, and asked them 3 very open-ended questions. What are the biggest challenges confronting Africa? Number 1. Number 2, what should universities be doing about them? And number 3, what stops them doing so? Just very open-ended questions. And it was people on the ground talking with people in the market, etc. And then we gave all the data to Times Higher Ed, and they sort of boiled the answers down. Now, let me just read the top 3 answers for each of those questions. So, the biggest challenges confronting Africa. Number one, by a lot, was bad leadership and corruption. Number two was high unemployment. And number three was inadequate resources for research and innovation. And this is just people on the street being asked this question. What should universities be doing? The first was equip students with the right skills, so practice, technology, and entrepreneurship. The second was to nurture positive character and ethics. And the third was to provide infrastructure and technology to enable innovation. So what stops universities doing so? Number one on the list was funding and resources. Number two on the list was leadership and management, that's us. And number three was opportunities for research and innovation. Now, it's really remarkable how consistent and how much, people coalesced. And when I say these are the top three, like when you look at the graphs, it's like this hockey stick. And the top three are very high. They stand out completely from all the other answers. And I would suggest that actually should be a driving guideline for the Education Collaborative. In addition to that, Rose shared with us last night at the leaders' dinner work that's going on for measurement and evaluation for our work as a collaborative, which will be helpful. And then the metrics that Times Higher Ed is publishing, I think, also serve as a good base for it. So I think, Peter, we are going to get some really good guidance from this work.
No, I'm glad to hear this, Patrick. And when Rose was presenting yesterday, one of the things that I really appreciated with the metric that you're using is the fact that you're focusing on the students,
right,
and the student outcomes.
Correct.
Yeah, this is very important. But I'm not the best place to talk about. What is unique about this framework that differs from what is out there in the rest of the world in ranking frameworks or benchmarking frameworks? And what are we doing or planning to do differently in order to ensure that we have better adoption? I know among the academics we have in our continent here, there are some who are, I would say, almost violently opposed to ranking. And I've been in those conversations in my time, and sometimes for good reasons. So what is different in this case that we need to highlight here?
Yeah, so Peter, you're right that there are people who are very skeptical about rankings. So there are two kinds of rankings going on out there for universities. So there are global research rankings that really are measuring the levels at which faculty are publishing in peer-reviewed journals, the levels at which those publications are being cited by their peers. And it's very well established, it's a very straightforward thing to measure. And so this is something that people measure a lot. Now, as you might imagine, global North universities that have a lot more resources do great in those rankings. African universities don't do as well. I think University of Cape Town is a top one in Africa, and they're usually like number 200 in the world and so on. So there's that. There's also, if you look around the world, there are often regional rankings and sometimes country-specific rankings. Like every region, you go to the Middle East, you go to Latin America, you go to North America, Europe, they all have other rankings that measure things that matter to them. but there's no ranking that is focused just on sub-Saharan Africa, right? So in a way, this is the first time that we're going to put sub-Saharan Africa on the map in measuring things that matter to us. I saw a ranking that was done in Japan. This is just for Japan, where they're measuring teaching and learning and critical thinking, right? Because I suppose the universities or the government in Japan decided this was an area they needed to improve on, and they started to measure it and actually see how they do. And the interesting thing about the output of that ranking is you look over 5 years, and all the universities are getting better on all the metrics. So your point about when you measure something, you do better at it is actually true. And so for us, I think setting the metrics is incredibly important. There's another ranking that has now been discontinued, but that ran for a few decades and was very helpful. There was a World Bank ranking on ease of doing business. And again, that ranking, the real important thing about it was identifying what are the parameters that influence the flourishing of private sector, right? The ease of registering a company, access to electricity, enforcement of contracts, infrastructure, etc. And measuring all countries on this really helped countries, governments, do better at making it easier for the private sector to flourish. And we saw things improve globally, right? So hopefully this ranking has that same effect in African higher education.
Thank you, Patrick, for that. And I just want to say that for us in the MasterCard Foundation, we see this as really a powerful collaborative, in part because of this. The fact that you are bold enough to say, we are going to forge for student-centeredness, ethical leadership, great learner outcomes, and we are going to measure it and assess our progress as we go. This is something that doesn't happen so often. And measure it with that context, the sub-Saharan Africa context in mind. That has never happened before. So we're really excited about that, and our commitment to continue to be supporting this remains very firm and strong. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.